Hi, it's Dr. Michael McNeil here. It's now getting into the well into November, so I've had to move upstairs into my winter office, which is the smallest, darkest, normally the coolest room in the house. But this time of year, because it's such a small room, it's so much easier to heat. So I was struggling last week in my summer office, and it was too cold in there by the end of the when if the sun wasn't out and it was just too cold. So I finally had to come up here. Probably I think last year I managed to get back in the winter one, back in the summer one. I mean, probably within a couple of weeks of starting of January. It was really great. But now I'm in this one. What I wanted to talk about today was it's actually one of the subjects I'm most interested in. I think I did my whole masters on what was called Dominion theology, and that's got this interesting reputation within even the Christian world, and it's really a subject that sort of like I think sits on the boundary line between what people would think of as philosophy and what people would think of as theology. Uh, so, in some ways, people might call it philosophical theology or theological philosophy or these labels, which I'm not sure are particularly useful or helpful anyway. But it's because but there is some real big, how can I put it? There's some real big uh, philosophical questions uh, which really flow out, I think, of this subject. Because if you uh, it if you because really you're talking about political involvement, and it's like the main philosophical question which you're going to have regarding political involvement, I think, and is that and in the practice of of how we govern, how we govern ourselves, and or how we allow ourselves to be governed, the real uh, philosophical question, which really stems from and our relationship to the state. Sorry, let me get that out right. Yeah, your in a sense your relation of yourself as an individual to the state and to your government, and what and their relationship to you. This is a real. That's a real. That's got all sorts of philosophical dimensions to that. I would say, and different questions that you need to answer, because you if you it is an argument that's been held at the moment. I mean, interestingly, it came up during the if you've been I'm sort of like an avid follower of what's been going on in the US with the presidential election, and I think I've been following that quite closely for the last couple of years. What's been going on there, and in a sense the astonishing comeback of President Trump, whether you like him or not. I mean, that was just a one way or another, that was probably one of the biggest political comebacks of all time, wasn't it? Somebody who was totally, who seemed to be totally discredited, and then suddenly comes back and is re-elected president. I mean, it was just an astonishing story. But I've been following that, and when he was first elected way back, I think in 2016, there was such a uh, there was such a reaction in many ways within amongst Christians that either hated him or loathed him or sort of like rejected him, because he made all sorts of overtures, didn't he, to the evangelical community, and he had Mike Pence as his vice president for that specific purpose. I think the specific purpose, having Mike Pence there was because Mike Pence was a member of the evangelical Christian community, and he was making in a sense a pitch to them, because he saw them as I don't think it was a necessarily a cynical political action, because he saw them as as an enormous voting bloc within the US. I mean, it's one of the issues I want to address when I do this talk is the legitimacy in principle of Christian political involvement. I think that's something I really want to sort of like dig into. Is to make a case for the legitimacy of involvement, because one of the astonishing facts to me anyway is that in the US, I think it was like, I think something like 40 or 50% of evangelical Christians weren't even registered to vote. And so I mean, we wouldn't, the US would, if all the Christians voted, there would never be a problem with, regarding, establishing some sort of a program in which, Christian principles were there, but moral principles are there. And so there's been a very strong stream, particularly in what you might call fundamentalists. So, it evolved and really crystallized within the fundamentalist movement in the early, probably from say 1910 onwards. I think probably 1914 was when I think maybe the first volume of the Fundamentals came out, which was an academic expression of fundamentalism. But fundamentalism itself, it slowly, I think, evolved from the prophecy conferences in the 1870s in the US, because what began to happen was that liberalism became very, very strong. The influence of Darwinism became very, very, very strong. Various forms of humanism, and you had the aggressive sort of rejection of Christian principles and Christian values and Christian norms, and say in Nietzsche and some of the continental thinkers. And so many, it became, when people saw this happening, I think the first one, maybe I'm wrong here, maybe it was either 1875 or 1895. I know I studied this. I did this in detail in my master's thesis. So I will put a link to this. I think I've got a PDF of that on my blog. And those prophecy conferences were like a reaction to people considering that the world was getting darker and darker and darker and darker, and really the function of the Christian church was like they were creating, like building a Noah's Ark, and the only purpose of the Christian church was to rescue people from the impending flood, when the world was going to be destroyed, and we had to withdraw and abandon and leave the apostate culture in which we find ourselves in, and just evangelize and preach to people and grab them, because the Antichrist is coming, and there's going to be a one world government, and if you're the something called the rapture doctrine began to appear. I think the first hints of it were, say, in the 1830s, and then I think there was two possible streams of which came out. Two possible origin stories regarding that doctrine, and I think one was around the 1830s, one was around I think late 1840s, and I think there's some linkage between them. What I can remember, I haven't read this. I haven't read that part of my thesis for a while. When I sort of like go through the historical events that eventually gave rise to the rapture doctrine, because one distinctive thing, it's something called, if you're interested in eschatology, which is just it's a posh name for the theory of last things or the last days, because in the Jesus often spoke about the last days, Paul spoke about the last days, and the last days actually began when Jesus ascended to heaven. So we're 2,000 years into the last days at the moment. So this what's called dispensationalism, which is which the cornerstone of dispensationalism is the rapture doctrine. The idea that there's going to be a secret removal of the church. The world's going to get darker and darker and darker, and then there's going to be a secret removal called the rapture of all the Christians are all just going to disappear. If you've ever any familiarity with the Left Behind series or some of those films that I think I've got a series. I think it's Revelation, Apocalypse, and Judgment or something. And those 3 films are actually, I think, a little bit better than but the Left Behind series, gosh, 20 years ago, the books and everything, they were mass sellers within the Christian market. So you can see how much of a market there was for this type of thinking, for the rapture thinking. And he had, when he had those prophecy conferences, the idea, the work was the world was getting darker and darker and darker, and more apostate, and morality was falling apart, and you had Darwinism, and you had what actually happened within, say, the academy was that there was something of a reaction initially within the academy, and you had those who were theologically conservative, and they generated this thing, under the editorship of R.A. Torrey, who was a famous evangelical figure, but who was also an academic figure, and they organized what became known as the Fundamentals, which is like a 4-volume set, and then it is basically an academic set. I think one of the later volumes, if you get the full version, I think there's like an abridged version, which I would say is not worth having, but you can get the full version, which was like 3 or 4 volumes. And I think in the last volume, it's a little bit more pastoral, and you've got people giving what you would call Christian testimonies of their conversion and stuff. But basically, you've got in the first 3 volumes, you've actually got like an academic reaction to theological liberalism, which was, what was sweeping the academy at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And you had people who were very, very, had excellent credentials, who were responding to some of the, what seemed like this irresistible tide of theological liberalism, which was causing sort of like the denominations like the Baptists and the Presbyterians and everything. And they were basically splitting into what you might call the liberal wings and the conservative wings. And you got out of, say, in the case of the Presbyterian Church, you even had sort of like, what happened was that the Princeton, that was the great, Christian university, the Ivy League university, which is still going today, and the seminary there, it split. You had the conservatives who split off and who went to form, under Machen, they formed sort of Westminster Seminary. And so you have these different, you have this sort of great splitting and separation of the conservative or the orthodox into their own colleges and their own universities, and from the liberals. And so, and alongside that, you had the almost total withdrawal of what you might call what people commonly understand as fundamentalism, because there's an enormous confusion about the term, because those 4 volumes that are called the Fundamentals is not where the term fundamentalist comes from. The term fundamentalist was actually coined by newspaper reporters, I think probably, around that time, who referred to a particular form of populist preaching. And the thing was that what became known as fundamentalism, that, was very, very anti-intellectual. They were also obscurantist, which is a posh word for, withdrawing into your own, if you like, cultural ghetto, and you often present straw men arguments regarding your opponents, but one of the dominant characteristics of what would be called fundamentalism at that time was it was rigorously anti-intellectual, because it saw the academy going liberal and denying the truths of the scriptures. And it was just in many ways a very visceral reaction to that, and on the back of that, a rejection of what you might call the academy. But then you got, especially within Presbyterianism, with Westminster, the Westminster Theological Seminary, you nevertheless had, that stream, one of the great things I think you have to give Presbyterianism credit for, Orthodox Presbyterian at least, is there's a great intellectual heritage which they've maintained, and some of the greatest thinking, I think, within the Christian community has come from the conservative Presbyterians, I would say. And I'm not, I've got no skin in the game there. I mean, I was in a Pentecostal church when I became a believer, and I've always been on that side of things. But especially when I was doing my masters, and when I was studying Dominion theology, you realise how wonderfully, in many ways, or how the great intellectual depth of some of the Presbyterian thinkers. And then you had the Dominion theology movement proper, which was in many ways a rediscovery of some of the early principles within the Reformation, especially within the works of Calvin, and his view of the law of God, and so when you look at that sort of like that movement, in the 1970s, and all the work that was going on there, and how during the 90s how it began to influence the charismatic movement as well. So you had a lot of they were often invited to sort of like to do seminaries and involve some of the what would be called the more charismatic sort of like leaders. And so you had a very interesting sort of repoliticization of Christians getting re-involved within politics. This was particularly, I think, seen within the US. I would love to say that that's happened in Europe. As myself, as a British person, I would love to say that we've seen that, but I would say that it's been very much a minority position. You just don't, the level of political discourse, and one thing that struck me was, I think it was 2010 when David Cameron was our Prime Minister. He's interestingly has just re-entered a couple of years ago back into mainstream politics within the Conservative Party, which was interesting. But one thing that really struck me was that when he spoke about the church, it was like he was I wouldn't say he was making fun of it, but he was just saying how totally irrelevant it was. And he was just saying, he was almost saying, I really wish the church was more serious and more relevant, because I don't want to tell the church what to do. Why should I be telling the church what to do? It was like, they're so far behind the curve in many ways. There wasn't that great, although there wasn't the great change that went on, I think, during the 1970s. And then, I think it was President Carter in the US who was the first one to really try to bring faith right into the center of the political discussion. And I think then you had Ronald Reagan, and you had the Bush dynasty, and they always appealed in some way to the Christian voting bloc. And then I think you saw it most obviously with Donald Trump, who opened up the White House and got an evangelical council, and he really tried to connect with that bloc. Now some people consider that as cynical, but I think that anybody who's been close to Donald Trump regarding that, I think it's Paula White who's his spiritual advisor, and I've recently watched stuff from her, and or heard discussions that are going on, and some of the discussions that they had with President Trump, that it wasn't just the issues which were important. He was genuinely interested and concerned and wanted to hear, what does the Christian community think about this? And so I don't think some people get very cynical, don't they? Said, and there was a lot of that going on during the 2000s of, presidents just giving lip service at election time, trying to get the votes. And, even, President, Obama, when he was running in 2008, he appealed to the black evangelicals and said that marriage should be between a man and a woman, but as soon as he got in power, they abandoned that. But the idea was to get the black evangelical vote. So, but you can see this. So one of the things I want to do, I suppose, with this talk is to make the case in principle that Christians should be involved, and then specifically, I'll probably, I should imagine this will go on onto a part 2, but then to look at Romans 13, which, if you like, is the locus classicus of that whole argument of how do Christians view the state, or what's our attitude to the state? Because I think if we bring this right back to, excuse me, I think it's become very, very much in focus again. How do we view the state? I think I just remembered what I was going to say about 20 minutes ago. I think one of the reasons why this is such a big question in your basic view of the state is, and it actually happened within when I was talking about the American presidential election so I think somebody created like a film, which I think was released, maybe it was released earlier this year. And it was basically like one of these hatchet job sort of films that were basically trying to, talk about the Christian nationalists who were supporting Trump, and, basically labeling them as domestic extremists, and, and they had this sort of like idea of a theocracy, and, it was a real, I think one of the co-producers of the film, they showed, because there was two people who were real drivers behind, and one of them was a bit like a Southern Baptist, who was, a never Trumper Southern Baptist or something. And then the other person, the other producer of the film, and I can remember seeing them in this discussion, and the one who was the Southern Baptist was talking about, we honor our God, but his problem was his co-producer was like an atheist, is known as an atheist. It's like, it was one of these farcical sort of situations. But it showed how faith was the relationship of faith and the Christian's view of the state and the Christian's relation to government. They're very, very important questions. And I think somebody, in discussing that film, actually, and when they were discussing the reaction to the film as well, they were discussing the reaction in so-called conservative Christian circles to this film. And they were saying that some people were scandalized because it was saying that our rights don't come from the government, they come from God. And that is one of the fundamental philosophical questions there, is where do our rights actually come from? Because if our rights come from the government, then the government giveth and the government taketh away. Okay, the government is the final authority. So if in whatever form of humanism it is, that's a non-religious sort of form of humanism. I mean, there are religious forms of humanism. We have to acknowledge that there are Christian humanists there, and they're probably humanists of other religions as well. But when your fundamental question that you need to ask, and this is one of the key questions there, is where do our rights actually come from? If they are granted, but that's one of the reasons why the American founders framed the Constitution in the way that they did, and they actually said that we consider these rights. These rights come from God. They don't come from the government. And all the Constitution is doing is recognizing those rights that have been given to us by God. And that's one of the reasons why the American Constitution is such a powerful document. And it's one of the reasons why globalists have been working so hard to try and undermine the Constitution and to get rid of the American Constitution, because it's standing as a roadblock in the way of their great globalist utopian vision. So these are not abstract questions, that we're dealing with here. These are really, your relationship as a believer or as a Christian to the state is a really important issue. So obviously I'm coming at this from an issue of, say, Christian philosophy. Some of my other discussion of my work and my thesis has been more generally philosophical, and but I do hope that this has nevertheless got some enough of interest to somebody who's not necessarily coming at this from as a Christian or as a believer, but would like to understand how get some sort of understanding of how would people of faith deal with this issue. And I think I would encourage you to carry on watching if you've somehow just come across this and you're thinking, oh, is this just going to be somebody talking about Christianity? No, I'm talking about the relationship of what is our relationship to the state? What is our view of the state? And then consider in detail, say Romans 13, because if there's ever been one piece of scripture that's been more misunderstood, and I believe it's still very misunderstood in vast swathes of the Christian consciousness, is Romans 13, because it became a real issue during COVID, because one of the attacks against, say, Christians or against, people of faith that, belong to the Christian tradition, who were questioning whether or not, lockdowns were legitimate, or was there one of the reactions that were made was that people were saying, well, Romans 13 tells us to be that all authorities come from God, and for us to obey and to be in submission to the authorities. So, so if we'll do a proper reading of Romans 13 to describe it on a surface reading of Romans 13 would very much allow that sort of interpretation. Yet it's one of the pieces of scripture where you really need some sort of interpretive context to it, and you have to have, say, like a hermeneutical framework to really understand what it is. But if you just read it on the surface and you don't dig into it, you can get that impression, oh, it's just saying we Christians should always obey the government. And so, if you like, as a preview, I'm going to say that is not true. Christians do not always have to obey their government. There's strict principles within Romans 13 and a structure there that shows you when a state is legitimate or when it's not legitimate, because we can accept without contradiction that all authorities come from God, all governments, all states are instituted by God, and God creates those and God puts those in place. We can accept that as a principle, but we can deny that a particular instantiation of that principle, as seen in different governments around the world, are legitimate governments. And if those that call themselves states and call themselves governments constitute and arrogate to themselves beyond the definition that's found in Romans 13, then we as believers are not obligated to obey and to be in submission to those, because they've delegitimized themselves. So that's if you like, and in the extreme case, I'll be arguing that a Christian is perfectly within their rights as a citizen to join in even a revolution to overthrow a corrupt state. So that's, if you like, giving you a little bit of an overview of some of the issues we'll be talking about, and because I felt very much that I needed to address this issue because I was involved a few years ago in a what you might call I was going through a training course, and somehow there was sessions on. I'm not sure how it fitted in. There was a session on, say, on it was the start of I think of COVID, and so everything was online, and there was quite a reaction. And I'd written quite a lot of stuff regarding Romans 13 and what I viewed as tyranny of the government, locking people down and taking away their rights in the name of a public health emergency. And I mean, it's very interesting now because all those actions, and even at the time it was questionable and there was challenges, but it was like though in the UK we had something called the the Coronavirus Act or something, and it basically stripped people of their rights to assemble, their rights to go outside, but the legislation itself was illegitimate, and so everybody who was prosecuted or who was fined under that legislation was lately their convictions were quashed, and the damages were paid to them. And so that's an excellent example of a because within sense we don't have a written constitution like the US does, sort of. We do have though something called the law of land, which is called the Magna Carta, which was something that was, I think, 10th, 11th century, maybe even 12th century, and it was a reaction against the political tyranny of the kings, who said we are ordained of God. And it was the divine right of kings, it was called. And so within this was established some fundamental principles, which are really the British Constitution, if you like, and the right of somebody to basically live as they please, provided as long as they're not criminal, and to freely assemble and to freely labour, and very much the inspiration of what went into the Puritans as they went to the US, but our, if you like, our Jewish system of jurisprudence. There was, if you're in say a court in the UK, they'll refer to things like the dock, the bar, and if you know anything about it, you'll actually know that those are terms which are to do with being a mariner, being sort of maritime law, and so it's called the law of the sea because we already have the law of the land, which is called the Magna Carta, but there's been this big sleight of hand by the legal profession, and that has obscured our rights underneath this enormous blanket of legislation. And so whereas we haven't got that sort of like that guarantee of, say, the constitutional rights that you might have, say, in the US or other constitutional republics, but we've got this, but instead we had this Magna Carta that's been obscured because of the way our legal system has grown up over the last 800-900 years. And so a lot of the fundamental rights which we've got, because it doesn't matter what a government, what law or an act of parliament or something that a government passes, if it's fundamentally incompatible with these basic principles. You find this, I think, in the US, don't you? When they just had this enormous ruling, I think, with regards to it was called, I think it was, what's the doctrine called? But I can't remember the specific name of the doctrine, but it's like, if, say, the American Congress passes an act, a government agency interprets that act and comes up with all its regulations, and there was I think it was called something doctrine, which basically meant that if you tried to challenge that, as if you were as a private individual, or as a group, or for whatever reason you wanted to challenge what a government agency, how the government agency had interpreted the act, and actually said that the way they've interpreted that act was against the spirit of the act or something like that. But there was a doctrine that was established that said that the courts always had to defer to the government agency, which is what created the great bureaucratic state, the great administrative, some people call the deep state, the great administrative state. But there's been a very significant ruling, I think, in the last few months in the US, which basically says that whole doctrine, that whole assumption that the government agency, their interpretation of any particular act is the correct one, that's being overruled, I think, by the Supreme Court. So that basically means that this enormous bureaucracy that's grown up, that's basically, in a sense, tyrannized over vast swathes of the business and people. I think in some states it's, say, I think I read in New York that I think you had to go through some if you say you want to open up a fast food place or something, a burger place or something, if you wanted to do it legally, like legitimately, the number of permits that you have to get and all the competing, it's astonishing. It's absolutely amazing. And that's one of the reasons why when you saw with the legal assault on President Trump and the all the different activities of the state, and so these are not just sort of abstract issues. These are real issues that we need to have some sort of view as a Christian, as a Christian community. And obviously, I'm speaking as a Christian, so the idea of the legitimacy of engagement and the importance of engagement, the moral case for engagement, all these things I think are very, very important, because we were basically tyrannized over by our governments in the last few years. And even and when you consider sort of like the case that if you're going to just accept that surface reading of Romans 13, then what are you going to say to, say, the apartheid, the church leaders who were dealing with apartheid? You would say that their opposition to apartheid was illegitimate, because because the government, the South African government, would regularly quote to the church leaders who were who were opposing, the government with apartheid, or fight against it. We all know Bishop Tutu, don't we? He won a Nobel Peace Prize, and one of the criticisms labelled at him by the apartheid government was that Romans 13 tells you that you should be in submission to the governing powers, and your opposition to us is illegitimate. And that's, and the idea that that we should, that we can't oppose, say, that if you were, say, a Christian living in sort of Nazi Germany, or living under Mussolini's Italy, or in these various, pick any place around the world where you're, where it's a tyrannical government that's oppressing you. Are you trying, are we actually really saying that the only opposition that we can have in those such situations is some sort of weak, passive opposition to it? Because that's what I was on this convocation, and these matters were being discussed, and the leader, who somebody I very, very much respect. I would, in other, I think I consider them as one of the, I think prime thinkers within what you might call, what's it called? I think I'm trying to think of how it's self-identified. I think the prophetic movement, maybe, it's probably the best way of describing it. And they're one of the the principal British leaders within that movement, and there's somebody on most topics. I really value what they say, but when this was being discussed, and the push and some of the arguments that were being made, and there is like a little book that I think that was brought out this year, which I will put in the description, which presents this point of view that was presented at the convocation, really, which is very much an agnostic view. I think I would call it like a politically agnostic view, where you're saying that that the form of government's not important, that there's nothing more nothing more desirable than, they say, from God's point of view, of a democracy or a monarchy, or or if it's a strong man, sort of like authoritarian government. It was almost like saying that that God's going to work through whatever government there is, and that there's no preference expressed within Scripture for any form of government. And so it was a very much what I would call a politically agnostic view, and also, but the whole implications of that view, and I think the way it was argued, I reacted very strongly against it. I must admit, I really, I think I listened to it once and I thought, gosh, I'm not sure that I completely got what the argument was that was being talked about, because I was on the call, but I was just thinking, wait a minute, I'm reacting very strongly against this, because I think it was talking about how, how we should react to being locked down and I'm not being able to sort of like go outside and be told we can only go outside for an hour a day, and and it was really sort of like making the case that the right Christian attitude to these sort of things is to just accept, and that didn't sit well with me for whatever reason. I'd already written a few articles about that where I saw it was tyranny, because I felt that it was empirically false, the arguments that were being used from the point of view that justified the lockdown that the government was using. There was no empirical evidence. The way they used the evidence, they weren't being honest with the evidence. They weren't being honest with, the medical evidence. You can look, through I ended up doing quite an extended study in it, where I took 3 months out almost from doing my doctorate and just did all this research, because there was something with it that just didn't sit right with me. And you can look at all the, you can look at the UN reports, and you can look at all the different, you could basically look at all the stats and the science to me, how many people were dying of respiratory diseases, how many people were dying of COVID, and you could do this. And I said, well, this is just illegitimate. The way the government has used and presented the evidence is illegitimate. And so how can you say that we should be, our moral responsibility is to obey these dishonest government ministers, and who obviously had some other agenda that was driving them and pushing them. And so that I reacted very strongly to, because I was on the call and I thought, is that really? So I listened to it again and I listened to it again, and I thought, no, I haven't actually misunderstood what they're going on about, and they really actually believe that this is legitimate. And like I say, I will. This is not a personal criticism of that person, because I still respect that person very much, and I enjoy their ministry, and I received an enormous amount from, my time where I was there. And so, it's not a criticism, but I'm just trying to push the conversation on, because when I was just doing my own research around this issue of, how does the Christian react to the state? What's our relationship to the state? I'd already read what I consider probably one of the finest expositions of Romans 13 that I've ever read, and that's actually by Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, and he was a famous evangelical preacher from the 1970s, who, in fact, I think he retired in the 70s. I think he died at the end of the 70s, but he was at Westminster Chapel from, I think, the mid 1940s. I think he was trained as a physician in the 30s, and in fact, yes, because I think there was occasionally where he's talking about the First World War and stuff as well as. But he was very well known as an famous evangelical preacher in Westminster. It's called Westminster Chapel in London, and it was also connected with. He was also an expert on the Puritans, when obviously the Puritans left Europe and founded the US, and you've got all the Puritan input into the early American colonies and the founding of the Constitution. And so so this guy's not like a crazy guy, but he's not somebody that's on the fringes. He's not like a Christian revolution anarchist or something. This is a straight down the line evangelical preacher, and his discussion of Romans 13, which I'd already read, I think, before I was involved on this call. And so he makes the case that Christians can be involved in rebellion, they can be involved in in a revolution, and he basically establishes the very well. I mean, there were points of difference which I discuss in my thesis. I think some of his assumptions that he was talking about of the, if you like, what we might call the Judeo-Christian assumptions of our country. I would say some of those assumptions that he was saying we can assume this. I said, well, you can't assume that anymore, and there are differences. And what if the platform of your political party? Because one of the discussions that he has is where he talks about you can have equally good Christians saying we have three main parties in the UK. There's a little bit of a fragmentation now, but really we've got two big parties. One of the big parties, which our left-wing party is called the Labour Party, the right-wing party is called the Conservative Party. And at one time in the early 20th century, the Labour Party split off from what was called the old Liberal Party, which was like 19th century Victorian, European liberalism. And that split, really. And then you had what was left, the old Liberal Party. Now we had the Social Democratic sort of like party. But really, there's two big parties. And you've got like a host of smaller little parties. And, but really, our politics is very polarized in many ways. And the two main parties, because of the way our voting system works as well, is that it amplifies the vote of, so even if we can even have, I think it's amazing. Our last general election, the Labour Party has got something like, I think it ended up with 2/3 of our seats in Parliament, but it only got 30% of the vote because it concentrated on the big urban areas where there were lots of seats, and they were very smart. I think they must have learned this from the Democratic Party in the US, I think. But they were very smart. They just targeted getting the urban areas, and they managed to amplify their vote and got themselves into a very powerful position within Parliament. So we can see that in the sense in what's gone on. These are how we react and our relationship to the state. And and I found that Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones is sort of like exposition of that. I'd heard this, and then I went into this convocation, and I thought, and I thought, well, this is totally, the idea that the only resistance you can have is some sort of weak, passive resistance in the background. I found, that I found it so difficult to actually think. I don't understand this, because normally the ministry of this of this person, and of the movement that they're an integral part of and an important part of, it's normally really, really sharp, and it's normally, and I was just amazed that our knowledge as believers was so low on this issue. So that's one of the reasons what motivated me, in the sense, during the masters, and to put it as part of my doctorate as well. The final chapters, really, I'm talking about political involvement, just the importance of political involvement, the history of political involvement of different groups who've been involved, and how historically, there's key features within the evangelical movement, and within the revivalist movement, and within the Reformation tradition. They understood the importance of political involvement and the imperative of political involvement. And so that's really what this, giving like a little bit of a preview of what I'm going to be talking about. That's how important this is, because if you don't have a proper concept of the state, and of the legitimate boundaries of the state, and of the function of the state, what's happened, and this has happened in our, you cannot see anything clearer that's happened within the last couple of 100 years within the states of Europe and all around, and around the world. And what's happened in in the US is that states have become more and more intrusive. They've become larger and larger and larger. They've appropriated more and more power to themselves. And when there's been these great crises, like the COVID pandemic was an exceptional example of this. They appropriated so much power to themselves, and so much money and wealth and influence to themselves and private companies. And, if you think about the Pfizers and the Modernas, and, they more money than we could dream of they made. And at the expense of destroying small and medium businesses. How many local small shops closed during that period, and how many we had big Amazon warehouses that were springing up when other people weren't even allowed to go outside. I thought, well, how does that work? How can you have a big Amazon warehouse being built, but the little paper shop around the corner is not allowed to open? Things like that really, really, people that, in a sense, a lot of those small little small businesses, they'll call them like mama and papa, grocery stores and stuff. That's a US term, isn't it? The mama and papa. But when you've got like a small local store like that, and suddenly people found their pensions completely wiped out. There were a few years, they'd been there 20, 30 years as a shop, going to retire within the next 10 years. Suddenly they weren't allowed to open. All the stuff was wiped out. And who gained? Transnational globalist institutions, they gained, and big global companies gained, who got very sophisticated tax arrangement stuff. They're like, for us, they're headquartered in Ireland. They do their EU business in EU and stuff. They got some funny sort of tax rule. There's this argument going on, and they basically end up paying no tax and making vast quantities of cash. Smart. They work the tax codes, and they work. So, to just sort of think of these without not considering these issues, I think we do a massive disservice, both as, say, philosophers and as Christians. We need to have some clear understanding of what's going on and how, and the importance of sorting these thinking these issues through. So I think I'll sort of stop here and pause here. But I've tried to give a little bit of feel of some other things I'm going to dig in more detail, because to me this is a really important issue. This is a very practical thing, and this is one of my views regarding one of my fundamental principles. I think regarding philosophy is that philosophy should be have practical implications, and you can work out your philosophy pragmatic. I'm not a pragmatist in the formal sense, but I do believe that the implications of philosophy is not just about making a problem clear, say, what might be called the therapeutic conception of philosophy, but it's also about solving the problems, and there should be practical implications. What's going on? What are the outworkings? What practical outworkings come from our philosophy? Okay, so I've just been busy testing out this mic. So this little wireless mic here, got this on there to hopefully improve the audio quality. So I think apparently I can get 6 hours out of it. So hopefully the audio quality is better on these videos now. But I'll pause there for now, and we will get on. I'll talk a little bit more, I think, in detail about why Christians should be involved, and then we'll move on to Romans 13. Okay, thank you very much. Hi, Dr. Michael McNeil here. Welcome back to part 2. Here, I just wanted to address, I think, what I consider to be one of the most fundamental questions for somebody who's approaching this from a Christian perspective. And indeed, I think that maybe this as well, just a general, let me get my words right here. What I'm trying to say is to provide some sort of general justification for being involved, being politically involved, and just being involved in the culture, and being concerned about the culture, and being concerned about the government of your nation. And I think this has big implications for just as a general principle, even for people, say, who are not approaching this from a Christian perspective, because something which I've noticed particularly in the last couple of elections in our country is that people have sometimes very, and backstopped by people who are famous and who anti-establishment figures who want to argue, against, in a sense, against voting, withholding your vote, not being involved because all politicians are corrupt, and power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and as a general, very, they were famous in the sense for withholding votes. And I can remember I was very disturbed when, gosh, this is astonishing to think, this is sort of like way back probably in 2019. The last 5 years have gone so much. I think we had like a snap general election there. I think there was a change of prime minister, and they were interviewing some people on the radio, and they were just interviewing normal, just say, single mum with children, and they were just sort of grabbing sort of people that they thought were representative of groups. And it was amazing. They were just asking them, "Oh, are you going to vote?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to vote, because I think they're all corrupt. They're all in it for themselves. They're not going to." And that sort of political, that detachment from the democratic process at all is to me, it's catastrophic, because what it ends up happening is that you end up with, say, I actually think it was the mayor of Los Angeles who, in Los Angeles, enormous city in the US, in California in the US, and I think the mayor of the city boasted that he was elected by 0.1% of the population of Los Angeles. And in our country, we get people voted, in the sense, people get elected on tiny proportions of the electorate, because they persuaded people that their votes don't really matter. And so what you end up happening is you end up getting groups that are very, very self-interested and very focused, very organized. They are extremely disciplined in the way they vote, and they end up, even though they're a tiny minority, they end up exerting an enormous amount of influence on the political process, because they tend to be sort of like special interest groups on the fringes of of an issue. Say, like, you're just picking an issue, say you're environmentalism, or something to do with environmentalism, maybe agitating for wind farms or something. And what you will find is that, generally they might only be representing, say, 1%, 0.1% maybe of the population. But if you've only got, say, 10% or between 10 and 20% of the population are actively involved, say, in voting, I think our turnout, even for a general election, might only be 53% of the population. So often, especially on local sort of there might only be between 10 and 20% of people who vote in those elections. And if you've got an extremely disciplined and well organized, so even if they're only 1%, they can say to, make a deal with one of the bigger parties and say, look, we will deliver to you, say, 1% of the electorate, and we will support you on these issues if you give us this, and this. And so their influence is massively amplified, because people aren't involved. And that, in the sense, that's something I think somebody called the tyranny of the minority. There used to be something in political philosophy called the tyranny of the majority, which is obvious what that means. If you're in Marx, that was one of his views, one of his programs for societal change was the tyranny of the proletariat. They said you have to use, because you're the majority as the proletariat, you have to use get organized, use democracy and then get into power and then deliver for you what you need because you're the majority. And so there was that stream of that type of sort of like Marxism. That's what it meant was the dictatorship of the proletariat was meant to be, that he saw that as the means of societal change, sort of like revolutionary. The revolution was something that was right on the fringes. The revolution became more mainstream with Lenin's correction of Marx. That was one of Lenin, that was one of his modifications of Marx. It said, no, we need revolution. The dictatorship of the proletariat, that was pushed aside in the sense, let's just go to the revolutionary stage. That was one of Lenin's corrections. But the tyranny of the minority is that if you can persuade the majority of people that their vote doesn't matter, you can get very organized and disciplined minorities who can exert far more influence than you would think they would. So and often they're very extreme as well. They're on the extremes of an issue, or they're on the extremes of society, and they end up pushing agendas and which are far outside what most people would be comfortable with. But they are vocal. They push their agendas, in our country, say over the last 20 years, you would call that for the LGBT, and then add on QIA, Two Soul, whatever now, the list has got steadily longer, but they're a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of society, but they exert an enormous amount of social influence because they're loud, they're disciplined, and they deliver for a particular party, in our case, sort of like on the left of politics, and they say, we will deliver our constituency of voters to you. And because so many people don't vote, this can make the difference between, loudly supporting this minority cause can make an enormous difference in a vote. So I think we really need to establish, just in principle, and that's not, I'm not judging, the LGBTQIA two-souled issue at all necessarily, but I'm just saying that's a good example of a movement that are very small in the sense of proportion of the population, but they've managed to gain far more traction in the political discourse, because so many people are disconnected from the political discourse. So that's one of our controversial but famous statesmen in the 1970s. There was somebody called Enoch Powell, and he was famous because of his river of blood speech, where he said that there would be rivers of blood flowing down the streets of Britain if we don't deal with the issue of immigration into the country, because obviously Britain used to be used to have an enormous British Empire, and there was a lot of, especially during the 70s, there was a lot of when the British Empire sort of like dissolved, really, sort of like at the end, during the late 1940s, after the Second World War, there was the British Empire that said the sun wasn't going to go down for 1,000 years, but within 10 years it had almost completely disappeared. But there was something called the Commonwealth, which was a bit of like it was some sort of the old colonies had some sort of special relationship with the motherland, and there was, especially for a time, there was preferential treatment to people that wanted to emigrate, and there was a great labour shortage at times in the UK during the 60s as well. And so there was an enormous amount of immigration was encouraged by the government as a policy, and Sir Enoch Powell, as he was later called, sort of like in a sense had the foresight to say that if the economic case suddenly gets inverted and there suddenly isn't a demand, this is going to create a lot of inter-ethnic problems. There's struggle, and he used very vivid language. There'll be rivers of blood, and he was obviously castigated as a racist. And but sure enough, late night, the 70s were a time of great decay in the UK, and there was a lot of violence, and racism and attack, and the communities did divide, and it was very polarized. And we had some bad race riots at the end of the 1970s, early 1980s, and so you can see how it's so important for us to be involved, because we need to deal with this problem of the tyranny of the minority. Otherwise, you get groups which are very extreme, but they can deliver a constituency, and so they have much more influence than you would think. And so now dealing with this, that's, if you like, just a pure secular, a pure secular case for being involved and voting, because you want to just moderate the political environment that you're in. You want to limit the influence of extremists, and by being agnostic or being indifferent, if you like, apathetic to the vote, to voting and using your vote, you by default are voting for the person that gets in. And that's quite a good thought to consider. That's a good way of looking at things, is that if because you in the sense you're trying to take the moral high ground and say, I don't agree with any of these politicians, they're all corrupt, I'm withholding my vote. But the problem is, when you withhold your vote, in practice you've voted for the person that ends up getting in. So it's always an issue. You can never stand behind. You're always going to be involved one way or another, because the main, especially in our country, and I think this is probably almost, I think this is almost a universal thing that's happened worldwide in the last century, is that especially in countries which we call democracies, the vote, even the vote, the government and the authorities in those countries did not give the vote to, there wasn't suffrage, which is just a way of saying who can vote. Initially it was only men, and then in the sense the aristocratic sector of society, they were the only ones that could vote. And then because of pressure from pressure there, the middle class could then vote. And then there was what you call, and all the then working class men as well as middle class men, and they could vote. And then I think it was only in the 1920s, 1930s, where after the suffragette movement, you actually had women that could vote, and people paid an enormous price to get the vote and to be able, in principle, to be politically involved. And I think as one of our biggest faults, as in our society, I'm speaking as as somebody who's British, and in our education system, is that people do not appreciate the enormous cost and the enormous struggle that it took to get for our nation to be basically a peaceful nation now. And people don't understand, where their grandparents and the great grandparents, they fought enormous wars and paid enormous price during the 20th century for them to have the liberty now. Because there's such an agenda for people pushing an internationalist, a globalist sort of agenda that that limits the national sovereignty and wants to get rid of the nation state. There's this big argument in political theory at the moment about that the nation state has run its course and we're now looking for more global government. Some of the reports and stuff that's coming out of the UN think tanks, they're arguing for more and more government that's beyond the nations. It's government. This is what the WHO is trying to do at the moment. They came to the prominence during the COVID pandemic, and they are busy working extremely hard at the moment, trying to get powers from the national government so that they can become a new governmental institution that can mandate and control the health policy of the different nations. They're really trying that hard. They've been scuttled the last couple of years. They haven't managed to get as much through as they wanted to. A new treaty, they call it. But it basically means that you're ceding sovereignty over your national boundaries to these international bodies. And all the time within our education system, the role of the cost of actually us getting back our national sovereignty, so that we could actually be a state that where the people within those state actually control their destiny. That was what 2 world wars were fought about. And so the very fact that our education system downplays that, it is evidence that the people that really are trying to manage us as their what they will call their subjects, rather than them serving us, rather than them being in a position where they're serving us and regarding our will. This is the big polarization in our society at the moment between what you might call elites, the liberal elites, globalist elites, and just people. So this is one of the reasons why all these, having a correct attitude, correct orientation towards political involvement is really important. So now, so in a sense, that's the secular case. That's just a general case. You need to be involved, because otherwise somebody's going to manage your life for you. And we can be involved in all different levels of, whether it's just from being a local representative through to regional, through to national. However we're involved, we need to be involved. So that's the secular case. Now, what if you consider this specifically from a Christian perspective? Now, Christians, this is one of the things. If you look at the history of the Christians and politics, and Christians and their involvement with politics, the 20th century was really, especially the first half of the 20th century, was a complete anomaly in the history, really, of the Christian church regarding their attitude towards a political involvement. And now that you have to really be a little bit more, I would say, granular when you talk about it, and a bit more nuanced, because Christians are not a homogenous group. They're not just it's very, very much a multifaceted thing. You've got old mainline denominations like Anglicans, Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, the stuff really that came out of the Reformation. You've got the Catholic Church, but then you've got the new, more modern churches like the Pentecostal Church, and then you've got the charismatic churches, which are really, when the Pentecostal experience came into some of those mainline denominations, in some cases they just represent a wing of those old mainline churches, which are almost like parallel even, but they've got a sort of like a renewed, they might call themselves renewed, but they're always a different wing. And you often hear this, don't you? The liberal wing of the Catholic Church, and the conservative wing, and the charismatic wing. They're different subgroupings, but often those groupings broke off and formed new groupings and new denominations, which, for all intents and purposes, they were new denominations. They might call themselves river churches, or, they were just charismatic house churches, home churches. And then you get sort of like prophetic churches. So to say that there's a Christian approach to politics is too simplistic. There's not. There's various Christian approaches to politics, but I think the point stands that within that period of the first half of the 20th century, it was really anomalous, and you had something which you might call classic fundamentalism, really from the 19 probably between 1910 and 1920. It really sort of like emerged as what you would call classic fundamentalism, the first wave of fundamentalists, people who really would take that label. And what characterized them they came out. There was historical precursor was what was called the prophecy conferences, which is around, say, 1870, I think 1870s onwards. And they were saying that culture has degenerated. You had the atheistic interpretation of Darwin, and the deconstruction of the religious meta-narratives, the creation story, and this whole, and the things that had really sort of bound together what you might call the European and the West, and the conception of, and I say Anglo-American, Anglo-European, the Western view of society is somehow, there was some sort of Christian substrata, Christian assumptions, and suddenly these things were being undermined, and this particular grouping within, say, the Christian within the Christian convocation, they viewed that as a fulfillment, say, of some of the prophecies within the New Testament describing the rise of the Antichrist and society becoming darker and darker and darker, and then the Antichrist is going to rule. And they saw that stuff. You find that in 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, obviously the book of Revelation, and there's also other prophetic books in the Old Testament that talking about, that deal with end times as well. But they're the main stuff. Some of them really saw what was going on in their culture, and this this purging of the religious, what you might call the religious meta narratives from society as an expression of the great grand secularization of society. And then you had people that were aggressively atheistic and pushing evolution, like I think it's Thomas Huxley, he was called Darwin's bulldog. He aggressively pushed this, the view, and also tapped on this sort of secular humanist conception as well. So you had this enormous pressure, and what some of these Christian groups reacted to that by these prophecy conferences and the outgoing of this. They had what was, you might call, there's something in theology, end times theology, it's called eschatology, the study of the end times. And there was really three traditional perspectives regarding the end times. There was something that was called premillennial, amillennial, and postmillennial. Now, the ancient church, premillennial, there's this period of called the millennium, which is meant to be a period where Jesus is ruling on the earth, and you have what you would consider a perfect society. And the reason why it comes from the book of Revelation, where it talks 1,000, 10 times 10 times 10, or 1,000-year reign. It talks about 1,000-year reign when the devil's locked up in hell, and the reason why some people are called premillennialists is that they believe that Jesus is going to return before this period called the millennium, and sets up the millennium. So Jesus personally will be setting up this period of this 1,000-year reign. Some people are called amillennialists because they deny that the millennium happens at all, that the millennium is in the sense, it's now, it's the church age. Now, if as somebody said, if you think this is paradise for the last that we're living in now, you're probably not a great view. But the amillennial view is nevertheless the view of the majority of what you would call the old mainline churches. So the Catholics, I think the Catholics, Methodists, Anglicans, most of the Reformed, most of the Reformed churches took on that amillennialist view. The premillennialist view was derived most directly from the Jewish conception of a Messiah, of the Messiah figure coming as somebody who's a military leader who establishes and re-establishes the state of Israel. And the early church took on that view for the first 200-300 years of the the Christian church. The premillennial view was the dominant view, I think, and that's universally accepted. That was the conversion of Constantine, or the so-called conversion of Constantine in, I think, 325. That changed the view of the Christian community, because the Christians weren't now a persecuted minority. They were suddenly Christianity. Constantine made Christianity the religion of the empire, and that completely changed people's conception of. And so they, in a sense, that was the beginning of this golden age, because suddenly, the emperor was a Christian, and so amillennialism became the dominant view. Now there is something called postmillennialism, and postmillennialism is when Jesus would return at the end of this millennial period. In a sense, the millennium is seen as a period when the churches, the power of the gospel, the power of the church, is spread throughout the whole earth and transforms society by. There's a picture in the Gospels of where Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God is like leaven in the dough. They always used images that were very relevant to the people of those days, but the leaven is like the yeast, and it works its way through all the dough. So the postmillennialists use that idea of the gospel as if the gospel's like leaven that goes through the dough. And once society is transformed, once the church in the sense has transformed and created a culture that is that has the Christian influence and Christian principles and Christian values throughout the whole of society, then in a sense Jesus, it's almost like it's like a present. Jesus returned, and this is the church presenting to Jesus, here is your world. The church in a sense has done its job, transformed the world, transformed society. And so in a sense it's a very optimistic and positive sort of like view. And what happened at the end of the 19th century, and postmillennialism was always quite popular in periods of when the church was obviously when the church was very sort of like successful, and when people were very optimistic as well. So you had sort of like periods where people adopted this post-millennial sort of like view of the transformation of society. But in the late, in the 1875, the exact opposite. People got very, very pessimistic about the outcome, and they could see the church in retreat. They could see Christianity in retreat. And so premillennialism, with its idea of an elect, of a select group, the society was going to get darker, but the church is here, witness, being the witness, creating an ark for the saving of the world. And premillennialism re-emerged, and there was a twist on premillennialism around in the 19th century, of something that was called dispensationalism. Dispensationalism is very much associated with the Scofield Reference Bible, but it had its origin, say, in the 1830s, 1840s. There's two different distinct accounts of its, which are nevertheless linked, associated with a particular group. But the leader of the Plymouth Brethren picked up on this idea of what was called. It centers around. Sorry, I'm jumping a little bit in my sentences here. It's centered around the interpretation of the week in Daniel. If you know anything about the book of Daniel, there's an amazing prophetic section in the book of Daniel, and it gets to a point where it talks about the last week. Daniel's 50th week maybe. So Daniel goes through the major empires, which were a big argument about Daniel, is because it's so accurate. It goes through sort of like the different empires that emerged. Some people are arguing, it must have been written afterwards. But, well, the problem is that Daniel talks about the Roman Empire, and he talks about sort of, Alexander the Great, and he talks about, this would would have to been assembled by a group of scholars after the fact. But there seems to be there seems to be good agreement that no, that this is actually basically written by one person. The language switches at some point because Daniel was involved. There's Aramaic, and I think there's Eastern Aramaic and Western Aramaic, and there's also Greek and in there because of the changes that were going on, and because of Daniel was an exile in Babylon, but there was a Greek regiment within the Babylon. So there's all these sort of arguments, right? I can't get involved in that, which it's a fascinating topic on its own, sort of like, the structure of the book of Daniel, because it was one of the most contested books of the Old Testament because it was so accurate and it was prophetic in nature. But it did take, I think, basically the view that Daniel was an ancient book written at the time that it said it was time. I think there are some historical details in there which were only known, I think, in the second half of the 20th century that they actually verified. And there were facts that that you wouldn't have known unless you were there during that period. So there's a very good case for the historicity and the accuracy of the book of Daniel. But the fact it's a prophetic book in the future has caused people a lot of problems. So even though it was found in a group, books were normally sort of like, they were in scrolls and they were grouped together and perhaps thematically or, and when they found all the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is one of the most famous archaeological finds of all time, I think maybe it was I'm not quite sure when it was, whether it was the beginning of the 19th century or the middle. There was lots and lots of biblical archaeology that was going on that was, that had all sorts of implications, which was very, very useful for verifying the biblical accounts, because the higher critical movement in the 19th century really attacked the historicity of the biblical documents. And they were arguing that, somebody couldn't have possibly known this, or this was written after the fact, or the stylistic differences here. And what a lot of the biblical archaeology did was to verify the traditional interpretation of some of the books, and they dispensed with some of the higher critical criticisms. And the book of Daniel was one of those books that very much that the higher critics really attacked, because it was, in the sense, it had all this prophecy that was talking about the future and that's obviously irrational. Nobody can know what the future is. Well, it's only irrational if you're a complete secularist that will actually believe that God can't communicate with you about the future. If you believe that God is real and that he can communicate with human beings in a clear manner, then, or through Daniel had a sequence of visions and all the other prophetic books of the Old Testament. It's like, if it's perfectly rational, then that the book of Daniel. So you're only betraying your own higher critical secular assumptions if you say the book of Daniel is irrational because it's talking about the future. You're begging the question. In other words, you're assuming something. You're not. Your presuppositions are controlling how you interpret, which is something, when I talk in my book, I talk a lot about that, controlling assumptions. So the interesting thing about, in a sense, just finishing off that thought about the historicity of Daniel, is that the scroll that Daniel was actually found in, and there was other books that were in that scroll, and people had been arguing about, I think it was maybe to do with Psalms and Ecclesiastes, maybe. And people had been arguing, higher critics had been arguing about the historicity and the time of authorship and stuff of the various books. But when they were found within this find, which people could date, and they could date accurately, people accepted the book, accepted the Psalms, accepted the book of Job or something, but they wouldn't accept, because of the dating. They couldn't deny, in a sense, the dating. But the book of Daniel, people wouldn't accept. Now, they wouldn't give a reason. The only reason they would give was because it's prophetic and it's talking about the future. It wasn't anything about, whereas really, if they were being consistent in their logic, it was where you accept those two other books in the scroll, you should accept the dating of the book of Daniel as well. I think there's a very interesting tape. When I say tape, gosh, it's cassette tape, which I think I've digitized since. So I'll see if I can find it. But there was Roger Price, who was a wonderful preacher at the Chichester Christian Fellowship during the, I think, the 70s and the 80s. well, I think he died, I think, of prematurely of throat cancer, I think. But he did an excellent series on the dating of the Book of Daniel, where he talks about all the different sort of like higher critical issues and the dating issues and the linguistic issues, and basically establishes and a very extremely persuasive case for the Book of Daniel being dated as the text itself suggests, that it was written and it was predicting future events. He really establishes that case very well. Now, interestingly, he was a premillennialist. He's like a modern premillennialist, but so he's somebody that's he did actually it was like a 3-tape series where he goes, he talks about premillennialism and postmillennialism and gives you a good review of that, and he tries to do it, especially in that series. He says I want to be as fair as I can regarding these subjects, but I am going to be arguing for premillennialism after this introductory sake. So he's really talking about the different ways that you can interpret prophecy and the different presuppositions. And if you're interested in the sense these views regarding end times and eschatology and the 3 basic perspectives that there are, I don't think you can recognize I don't think I could recommend a better series than that, because even though in the sense I'm a post-millennialist, because I nevertheless recognize his excellent scholarship and his great level of argumentation. He's a very rigorous scholar, and he will give you a great overview of that subject. So I will put that stuff in the description. So now dispensationalism was, to get back to the point, what dispensationalism was, if you like, an aberration of premillennialism. So it really focused on this one passage in Daniel, this so-called 50th week, I think it's the 50th week of Daniel, where it talks about this one particular period, and it introduced something called the rapture, this concept of the rapture, where this was going to be a silent removal, secret removal of the church. So some people talk about, are you a pre-trib? There's going to be this period, the 7-year period, which is called the tribulation. At the end of the tribulation, Jesus is seen as coming. So this week, if you like, is added on, whereas traditional premillennialism would just say that the world's going to get darker and darker and darker, and the church is going to be struggling, but its purpose is evangelizing, and it will be evangelizing, and even though it's going to be greatly persecuted, it still had a basic positive and optimistic view about the church. So even though the church might only be elect, it might be small, it might be geographically marginalized, it might be politically persecuted, it was nevertheless still had in it like the idea that it was still a conquering, overcoming body, and that Jesus would return and vindicate the church in the sense, and then the millennium would start. Whereas what was different about dispensationalism was that it really emphasized this period of the tribulation, of this additional sort of like 7 years where the Antichrist reign, or whether it's 3.5 if you think the Antichrist comes in to the temple as halfway through. There's all these arguments that people have about the sequence of event, but the important thing is that it focuses on this 7-year period, and it says at the beginning of this 7-year period, Jesus, in a sense, it's almost like there's 3 comings of Jesus. Instead of there being a second coming, there's like the second coming would be, for the dispensationalists, would be the rapture. So that's when it's a silent thing, where Jesus removes all the Christians from the earth, and because the Christians are removed from the earth, the Antichrist then has free reign. But it's a very pessimistic view. It's sort of like saying the world's going to get darker and darker and darker and darker, and the church has becoming more and more marginalized, less influence. But and then Jesus, in a sense, comes down and rescues the church, removes them, and allows this period that you call the tribulation. So the dispensationalists were very, very negative about culture. They were very, very negative about the world, about being involved in the world. They are very anti-involvement. they really viewed the church uh, as like an ark. If you consider sort of like Noah's Ark, you know, before the world was destroyed, Noah loaded up the ark, and so they often use this picture of, yes, the world's being destroyed. The purpose of the church is to build this ark and just to evangelize. There was a famous radio preacher in the 1940s who said, "You don't polish brass on a sinking ship." So basically, the whole of culture's apostate, sinking, dying, and but your purpose and your view, your mission as the church is to just snatch people out the fire before they go down to the fire's edge. You're snatching them out. It's aggressively evangelistic, nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with involvement in culture at all. Your only purpose is to win the lost, to save the lost. And so obviously, if you're a dispensationalist, and that type of aggressive view was what characterized what was called the fundamentalist movement. They advocated withdrawing from society, aggressively evangelistic, aggressively anti-intellectual, and in a sense we were in our little cultural ghetto, you know, where we rescued people from the world that was dying. Now, so it was a distinct movement. That's the thing. What people often confuse, and fundamentalist scholars are guilty of this themselves, because that was the first generation of fundamentalists. By the second generation, which you're talking about in the 1930s, 1935 perhaps, and especially with the establishment of what was called Fuller Seminary, that really marked in a sense, I'm maturing the fundamentalist view where they recognized the need for scholarship and for biblical exegesis, and for, you know, a much more, there was far less of an what's called the obscurantist sort of like point of view of let's withdraw from everything, withdraw from culture. There was something of a re-engagement, at least in recognizing the need to be academically respectable and rigorous in what you were doing. It was still your own institutions. They didn't advocate going out, you know, and returning to the institution, but they did recognize the value of creating their own institutions. So the second generation, were mid 1930s, and there is a famous book called Fundamentalism, which I think was when was it originally written? It might have been, its first edition might have been at the in the mid 1930s, but I think it was after the second 1949, 1950. I think it was reissued. I'm struggling to think off the top of my head the author, but again, I will put this in the description as a reference. And this is also on my website. I also have this as part of my master's thesis. So this the detailed arguments about this, and going through the different eschatological views and how that impacts on your political theology. Because if you believe that you're going to be raptured out of here, and your only purpose is to save the lost, you're going to have an extremely negative and dismissive attitude to politics. You're saying that's the world destroying itself. It's going to hell. Leave it. Forget about it. It's nothing that can be done. It's unredeemable. It's unredeemable. All we've got to do is fill up this ark and get out of here. So you can see how that dispensationalist view as an aberration of premillennialism, because premillennialism in its classical form was still very positive. It was still very triumphant, even though the church might be persecuted. The church nevertheless was still triumphant. Jesus would vindicate the church. Whereas dispensationalism was very negative. It was very culturally cynical, and it advocated withdrawal. It's a desperate view, actually. I mean, I find even though the rapture is amazingly popular I suppose within the circles in which I'm in as a Christian, I find it because some people say, oh, this is the greatest hope of the in a sense of the church, the great hope, the next great thing that's going to happen is the rapture. I think historically, as someone that's actually done historical research, and in the last, the rapture and has done more damage in the sense to the mission and the integration and the place of the church within society than any other doctrine. And often when the church has started to get back involved and has started to make an influence again in society, you get these theologies of imminent return, that Jesus is about to return, that completely distract it from this. People suddenly become focused on, oh, right, we're just going to get out of here now. The rapture's just about to happen. And so instead of being involved, these theologies of imminent return always distract people from being involved. And even in the book of, I think it's 2 Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul has to deal with, so either 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, they're both good books for the end times, because they give like little snapshots of Paul's having to deal with people trying to help the young believers get their end time theology right. But in there he talks about he has to go very hard. I think it's probably in 2 Thessalonians, he has to go very hard after people who had got so thinking that the return of Jesus was imminent, that he was just about to return, come back. So even Paul talks about that. He talks about, I think he says, because of, I think he maybe talks about it in Timothy, and where he talks about, because of all the trouble we have at this present time, because of the nature of the time, the struggles of the present time. So I advise that, in the lateness of the hour, I advise people who are married to live as if they're unmarried. For somebody who's unmarried, don't seek a wife. There was a very, very, very strong within the young church during this time of intense persecution, that they really believed that Jesus was just about to return. And so you even find that sort of like emphasis in some of what Paul's writing, but he has to later correct the Thessalonians, because people were so focused on this, thinking Jesus is just about to come back, that they actually started giving up their jobs and they stopped working, and so Paul had to correct them and actually say, well, if they're not going to work, they're not going to eat as part of the community. So there's always this sort of pressure that when the church starts really getting involved, that somebody says, oh, that you're getting involved in worldly ideas. We're not supposed to be those that are concerned with the earthly. We're supposed to be concerned with the heavenly and the spiritual. And you do get scriptures like that emphasize, that we're just passing through. We're just sojourners here on the earth, and that our citizenship is in heaven. And there's some glorious passages, in philosophy, in Colossians and Ephesians, that talk about our citizenship being in heaven, and that, and be concerned with the things above rather than the things on this earth. And people have historically very readily taken scriptures such as those to spiritualize their life, and to denigrate being involved in politics or being involved in music, art, engineering, whatever it happens to be, and saying that our focus should be on spiritual things and on winning the lost, and that's what our focus should be. So, in no way am I denigrating winning the lost, or denigrating the need for evangelism. Evangelism is one of the, if not the, function of the church. But the church also should be talking about. I believe that the church should be also involved in the rest of culture and the rest of society, because the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. There's not, and we were given a dominion mandate in Genesis to, create culture throughout the earth. The word that in Genesis, where it talks about go and rule and subdue the earth, the word there is where the word culture comes from. We were given the mandate to manage the earth and to create culture, and culture has involved in it all the disciplines of science and of art and the humanities. And so So the need for involvement very much derives within the Christian tradition from the eschatological view that you actually have and that you maintain. If you were, as the traditional fundamentalist was, the dispensationalists, as an aberration of premillennialism, if you believe the world was getting darker and darker and darker and more corrupt, you're going to withdraw from politics, and that's what happened with the early fundamentalist movement. And so it was quite an aberration. The first half of the 20th century was that they advocated withdrawing from those environments. That meant that, in a sense, that that meant the absence of that just increased the speed of degeneration and the immorality and the corruption, and we fought 2 world wars. Now, something very interesting happened during the 1940s, early 1950s, was that there was with the second generation of fundamentalism, and there was also lots of changes going on within what was called the Orthodox Presbyterian movement. J.G. Machen created Westminster Theological Seminary, and one of the person I study I talk about most in my work when I was in there was where you had Cornelius Van Til and he in many ways revolutionized the Christian Christian theory of knowledge, Christian apologetics. He revolutionized. He wanted to create an apologetics that was consistent with Reformed principles. It wasn't just an adoption of evidentialism, which became very, very influential within Presbyterianism through sort of like B.B. Warfield, and that had pulled in a lot of the Scottish what's called Scottish common sense realism and evidentialism. Van Til, in many ways, returned to what was more of a reformed, a purer reformed apologetic. He wanted to get rid of that stuff. He didn't denigrate the need for evidences and that, but he wanted to talk about the need for sort of like for presuppositions and basing, and a presuppositional view of apologetics, and basing your positions had to be rooted in scripture rather than rooted in philosophical systems that really belong to a non-Christian way of thinking. So he really wanted to be more rigorous than that, and he laid, in the sense, the foundation for a Christian epistemology that was based on scripture rather than derived, say, from some conception of natural law that was derived from common principles. These are all, issues that I talk about much more, sort of both in my masters and in my PhD when I was doing that, and that will be in the book that these videos are meant to be helping and preluding what's in the book. So I talk much more about this, why that was so different and what was so unique about Cornelius Van Til. But he laid in the sense the epistemological foundations of which is your theory of knowledge, and how that's what epistemology is really. It's just a posh name for the theory of knowledge. He laid that sort of like foundation of a basis in scripture, and it has to be derived and based in scripture. And that also, and one of his first disciples who really grasped this and who really understood and really converted this sort of program into, say, like a complete sociological view, and in a sense made it practical, and I said, well, how does this impact society more generally as a whole? How do we pull this into society more as a whole? Was somebody called R.J. Rushdoony, and he wrote one of the first commentaries on Van Til, and I think it was called on what, by what authority, by what standard, on what standard is one. Again, these are all in my bibliography. I can do. I think it's by what standard, because I think there was quite a lot of them, but very similar titles by Greg Bunsen did a couple of accounts as well, and they're all very similar by what's on what standard, but really arguing that and it was converting sort of like this general assumptions of Van Til. He really wanted to create, like, how do we convert this into a political program. So, and what was distinctive about Rushdoony as well, and the movement that what eventually became the Reconstructionist movement, which came out of his work, I think it's fair to say he was Gary North and Greg Bunsen developed very important parts of this, but I think it's fair to say that Rushdoony was really was the father of the movement, and he took Van Til's epistemology and developed a sociological theory from that. And so somebody who's post-millennial, generally, modern post-millennials are very much associated with and the Reconstructionist movement. Somebody who's post-millennial really believes, there was somebody called Abraham Kuyper, who founded a remarkable figure. He was a Dutch, he was actually the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, I think from 1903 to maybe 1906, but he founded a university, the Free University of Amsterdam. It still exists today. It secularized itself during the 1930s, but he founded that university. He founded a political party. He founded a denomination that split off from the Dutch state church, and wrote thousands of articles. He edited these newspapers and became a political figure. And one of the things one of his famous, in his writings, the most famous for, he said, so two great quotes, I think, which I'm just going to paraphrase them here, but he said, there's not one part of the visible universe that the Lord Jesus Christ does not proclaim as mine. So he's saying so he really denied that there was any secular religious distinction, or if you like, faith reason distinction, that sort of dialectic that had been so that became really hardened up through the medieval period, and the Reformed thinkers in many ways took on this, especially when the Reformation, I would say, when people degenerated from the initial Reformation views, they also took on this dialectic and this contrast between faith and reason. Whereas Kuyper's really saying that there's no secular, there's no religion, it all just belongs. The whole of the universe, there's nothing that doesn't belong. And so he very much emphasized the role of the church was to provide principles, and if you like, in a sense, an ethical, they were like the ethical guardians of the whole of culture. They weren't just in some realm, in private, personal realm, which is something that came out of the 19th century. There was people very much talked about religion was something personal and private, but when you go into the public square, into wider society, that's just something you privately have. There's nothing in religion that can speak to culture generally. It's all private, it's all you. And that's very, especially with existentialism and existentialist view of pride, that was all part of that sort of mix and those changes that came, and that the only thing that helps us and can speak to the whole of society is this new scientific way of looking at the world. because people consider Darwinism to have fundamentally undermined the credibility of say the early and historicity of the Bible generally. If you're going to dismiss Genesis, you're going to dismiss almost the entire scripture, because the scripture is founded and keeps referring back to Genesis. So religion, in the sense, if it had any role for anybody at all, it was something private, off in the in the privacy of your own home, but don't get into the public square. And that's still very the aggressive atheists today would very much say that if it has any role, it's something private. Keep it out of the schools, keep it out of the public square. Whereas, so if there's a one thought, so what I want to say, if to try and summarize and to bring this sort of like episode in a sense to a close, is that there's an imperative for us to be involved. If we don't get involved, if we don't see the need to be involved in politically involved, then we're going to be the victims of whoever is politically involved. And so there's we're called to be salt, we're called to be light. Because sometimes people use scriptures such as, it says, do not be yoked with unbelievers. And people use that as an excuse not to be involved, to say, like what they consider, say, the Christians to be concerned with spiritual things, and we don't have anything to do with the ways of the flesh. Romans talks, doesn't it? The old King James talks about the flesh. There's flesh and there's spirit. And flesh and spirit are in hostility and inimical to each other, and there can be no reconciliation between them. So it's like, just as there, don't be yoked with unbelievers, come out from amongst them, says the Lord. And so people use those scriptures to say, right, we're going to withdraw. But if you withdraw from society, you end up, we where we are in society at the moment, we saw the effects of that when people did withdraw, when the Christian church did withdraw, and there was ended up there being 2 world wars, and communism raped the planet, and 120 million people died. If nothing else, we have the evidence, and we have what happened when we did withdraw. But we need to understand that for the previous 2,000 years, and even the revivalists like Finney was very, very involved in politics, and he argued and he told his people to be involved in politics. He said, get involved with lawmaking. If you're not involved with the lawmaking, then you're going to get people who want to make bad laws. And that's an imperative for us. There's so much wisdom in what he says there. If you read his autobiography, I think there's 2 versions of the autobiography. There's a proper version and there's an edited version. Don't go for the edited version. Go for the proper version, because a lot of the stuff that people edit out of that gets edited out of these edited versions is the stuff where he's talking about politics involved, because they said, we're interested in the spirit of revivalism. We're not interested in that stuff where he's talking about politics. And in many ways they're missing the point there, because he was saying that the revival and the people being involved in politics and being involved in the social environment and being involved in the running of the towns and everything, they allowed the revival they promoted favorable conditions for revival. It's a bit like when Paul in 1 Timothy, I think it's at the start of 1 Timothy, where he says, maybe it's chapter 2 or chapter 3, but he talks about, I counsel that prayers be made for all who are in authority and everyone in there, that we might live a quiet and peaceable life. So the conditions that are there for social peace, that you can actually then go and do, if you like, the wider mission of the church, and the church can then go and do its evangelism, and it can then the social conditions and the importance of the church being involved in all the different levels of government with all kinds of people. That's Paul's emphasis there. He says it says, because the Christians generally had because they'd been persecuted so much by the Roman authorities, had a very negative view of the authorities. And one of the things Paul has to do at various places, and that's why Romans 13 was written. And in 1 Timothy 2, he emphasizes the fact God wants all kinds of people to be saved. That's the emphasis of that. That's the interesting thing about the 1 Timothy 1, is it really is talking about all kinds of people. It's not so much God wants all to be saved, which is often how it's presented in sort of like Arminian apologetics. Oh, God wants all of humanity saved. That's a different issue. Really what he's actually talking about there, he's talking about all kinds of people. That's why he talks about kings and princes and all that are in authority. The emphasis is that salvation has to reach all those different kinds of people. And so it's the imperative is on us, is to be involved at all different levels of politics. And Finney recognized this, and he encouraged people to be involved. If you know anything about, I think, Wesley was very involved, and he often used the services of the Count. I think she was called the Countess of Huntingdon. She was a political figure, and when they were being harassed and the people were trying to legally prevent them from doing things, he would get the Countess of Huntingdon, who had influence within the governmental realm, to create conditions that allowed them to carry on. And so, and you see this within, especially within the way Finney conducted his revivals during the Second Great Awakening in the US, is that he encouraged the people to be involved at a local level in all different levels. So this period of the first half that's why I say the period in the first half of the 20th century, people, because in a sense the modern evangelical movement came out of Finney's practice of evangelism, and in the sense of his in a sense he distanced himself from what you might call the hyper Calvinism of that prevented people from preaching basically prevented. Finney was the one that really sort of like arrested that and pulled people out from the traditional Calvinism and pulled them into a more preach the gospel to everyone in that modern evangelical movement sort of like came out of was a reaction. Finney deconstructed the hyper Calvinist view and the modern evangelical view with regards to the preaching of the gospel and aggressively preaching the gospel came out of Finney's perspective. But what they didn't pull out, with the exception of Machen when he founded the Westminster Seminary, I'm not sure how much contact Machen had with Finney or was aware of Finney's work. I don't necessarily think there was much contact, but Machen as well emphasized the importance of being involved with Congress. He often spoke before Congress. He argued the case against particular laws. They were very, very, very politically involved, and it was that, in a sense, that the fundamentalist movement and the evangelical movement that came out of Finney tended to denigrate political involvement. Some of the early fundamentalists, so even in the seminary, argued actively against political involvement and saw it as a distraction. And then you had the reaction, in a sense, within to liberal, because the liberal, with the emergence of the social gospel movement and Rauschenbusch's social gospel movement, which was more of a liberal interpretation of I think Rauschenbusch was a Baptist pastor, and as he saw the poverty in New York, he emphasized the social aspects, the social functions of the gospel, and some liberal Christians really focused in on that social work, and that, in the sense, alienated a lot more of the conservatives. And so you had this artificial separation of the social aspect of the gospel and the need for justice and for creating social conditions and for being involved in politics, that ended up being associated with liberal Christianity, and the conservatives became very much more those who were involved with aggressive evangelism. And but that's been very much an aberration in the history of the church, and it had, in a sense, catastrophic effects, both sort of like culturally and socially. And that was why, with the emergence of sort of like of the foundation that was laid by Van Til, and then Rushdoony taking and creating if you like, a program for sociological reform, he very much created an argument, the thought that came out of that within the Reconstructionist movement and other thinkers, which is what I went into in detail, in a sense, in my master's thesis. I traced that through. That can be found on sort of like planetmcneil.org //blog, and if you go to sort of like the thesis section, my thesis is on there, I'm hoping to get that published as well as a separate book just on this area, but that what flowed out of that was the Christian. It very much re-engaged and promoted a re-engagement with the whole of culture that came out of the Reconstructionist movement. That was one of the the most powerful contributions of Rushdoony, was that he created this entire movement that flowed out of that, with a post-millennial, optimistic, positive view about culture and about society, and about the need for every realm and every domain of culture. Now, where it was different, it wasn't saying that the church should be, this is important to recognize this distinction, because if you don't understand this distinction, you're thinking that it was reverting to the traditional Roman Catholic view of where the church during the medieval period was just a transnational hegemony. Basically the Pope reigned across the whole of Europe, and he had his own private army under what was called the Holy Roman Emperor, which as the name suggests went all the way back to sort of Constantine's period, or they claimed it did. There was one of the higher critics actually showed that the document was a forgery, but nevertheless there was the Pope had if you like, he anointed one of the kings, one of the royal dynasties within Europe. He would anoint them and say, "You're now the Holy Roman Emperor." And during one period, which is the most famous, probably the period most people would understand from history, would be the period of the Inquisition, where the Spaniards were anointed by the Pope as that whole dynasty. I said, "You're now my private army, and you must go throughout all the empire and get rid of all these horrible Protestant heretics." So they were basically the Pope's private army. And there was also the Jesuits, who were a complete Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. They actually became they became a branch of the Catholic Church, which wasn't underneath structurally. It wasn't underneath the bishops or the prelates or the monsignors, that sort of structure. They were completely separate, and they also had their own charter, and they basically became another Pope's private army. They're people often think of the Jesuits as mystical and the spiritual exercises and stuff, but they were in there. They have some amazing things in their foundational principles. Amazing things like if you lie, as long as you're doing it for the sake of the progress of the Catholic Church, it's fine to lie. It's fine to be dishonest. It's fine. They really did. They became vicious and torturers and another private army. That's not to say that all Jesuits are like that, and all. That's not saying that at all. It's not to say that they weren't. They're not. The whole of the Jesuits now are not like that. But during that particular nasty periods within the medieval period, the reigns of the I think they were called one of the Vici dynasty, the popes. And, when you dig into what they were like, they were utterly corrupt and utterly bound up within the politics of the different monarchs within Europe. And the whole apparatus of this papal hegemony was designed to suck all the wealth out of the different nations to the Pope. And so what is different about, if you like, about the sort of like the dominionist perspective, the dominion theological perspective, was that it wasn't a reversion to where this is what Kuyper was so good at with what he called spear sovereignty. It wasn't a reversion to where the church controlled and micromanaged the whole of culture. Like, we understand the persecution of Galileo, and it wasn't the purpose of the church is not to control intimately these different domains of human life, the scientific or the artistic or the musical or the dance or all these different aspects of culture. But what the church is supposed to do is to provide some sort of moral framework and testing, and to guard the ethics of society. So it's not to control, it wasn't being hegemonically, but it is to have some sort of structure where it works out in detail. The individual believers work out their principles. The church is concerned with the principles, and individual believers are very much concerned with how does this work out? How do I work out Christian assumptions and how does this work out how much involvement I'm working out with the help of those principles that the church enunciates. How does this work out if I'm an engineer dealing with sort of like projects? How is my Christianity going to affect the way I work? And so again, we'll look at that in more detail. This is one of the things I think that Lloyd George's, who I mentioned earlier, his probably in the previous video actually, the Lloyd George's account of this, of the role of different responsibilities and what the role of the individual relationship to all, an individual being responsible as an expert in their field and working out what the professional society should be, what the Christian professional society should be, are not, in a sense, just because one view of say, if we have, say, like a Christian a Christian association of engineers or something, just use that. Say there was a Christian association of electronic engineers. I was an electronic engineer. I did 2 electronic engineering degrees, so imagine there was like a Christian association of engineers or something. And what they often end up being, just as Christian unions and university do, is they end up being just vehicles of evangelism, really. And rather than being, whereas evangelism really is the business of the church, the business of a Christian professional association shouldn't really be evangelism. Maybe that's a secondary function, perhaps, and that's a big perhaps. But really, the function of the Christian association should really be those Christian professionals, those experts who are working out how does our Christianity affect the way this business is conducted. You see how different that is. And so this, again, so we're trying to say that, we have an imperative to be involved within the culture of our, and within all the different operations of our culture and our society. We don't withdraw and abandon it to itself, but we are to be involved and actively participating. One of the ways Martin Lloyd-Jones puts it was that just because we have a citizenship in heaven, and that's our real citizenship, that doesn't mean that we stop being citizens here on earth. And he said that's been one of the biggest heresies that has come in
to Christian thought is the idea that that now that we're believers, we withdraw from the culture and withdraw from the nations in which we find ourselves in. And obviously there, he talks much more, he extends this to discussions of pacifism and capital punishment, and these different dimensions of things that of how important it is for us to have an understanding and a perspective and something we can say about those topics. So I think what I've managed to cover a lot of ground here. I think so. I've probably done like 3 half-hour episodes in this one and one previous there, because this is something I feel very passionately about. This need to be involved and intelligent and understanding how to be engaged in our culture and understanding the needs for as professionals, as experts in our domain, that we Kuyper's idea of sphere sovereignty, where each different sphere has its own principles. So a science works on certain principles and certain values in there, so even though we have these separate, these should be allowed to grow and to develop as on their own right. The church doesn't control or constrict. It has got no business interfering in the details of what's going on there. But what the church does do is provide some sort of ethical critique of what's happening. So for example, if you were considering, issues connected with, say, reproductive health and IVF and where if you've got sort of like fertilized embryos, what's the status of a fertilized embryo? Is that a human being, or that's, say, an example. I can't go into sort of like detail on that because that's in a sense a bit outside my world of expertise. But the Christian professionals who are working in that area should have a clear, worked out, something that they believe is faithful to Scripture regarding how do we deal and integrate in those areas. It's not for the church to come in and say, well, that's because it's a fertilized embryo, that's obviously a human being, and therefore that's the end of the discussion, end of the argument. Let's not support any of that research at all. So some people take that view, haven't you? You've heard that sort of like view that, that's like a black and white description. No, somebody's created at the point of conception. Therefore, if you created embryos in this process, then they're human beings. So they're complicated arguments there. I'm not judging one way or another there, but you can obviously see that there's some careful thought needs to be done in that particular situation, because if you think that's the only dimension of that argument, that this is a person because this is a fertilized embryo, the whole point of that process and that procedure was that couples that were childless could have children. And it's like if you're saying, and you can see that actually there's going to be more children because of this process, there's going to be more children as a result of this process, and more families with children. And so just concentrate on one aspect of the problem, which is what is the status of the fertilized embryo that is used. If there's 4 or 5 or 6 of these embryos that are fertilized, which are then used as part of the treatment, and it may be that I'm not sure how the details of how IVF works, but if you've got the fertilized embryo that's then implanted in the mother, there's going to be more. There's a human being as the result of that. There's more people that have children as a result of that. So you can see that the black and white moral equation there is not as clear as it might seem if you're only considering one aspect. And that's why we need in all the different dimensions of culture, we need experts that understand, who can look and that can reflect. You might want to argue that, say, some professions are, you might always think that some things are neutral, like we're going to dig a trench and put a drain and blah blah blah. I said, how can there be any specific Christian input into that? Well, off the top of my head, I can't think of that unless there's specific dimensions in specific cases of how do we how do we manage this? What about managing the environment? What does our Christianity talk about managing the environment? So my real argument here is the necessity for us to be involved in all of culture and at every level of culture. That in my personal case, that stems from my, in a sense, my post-millennial eschatology, that believing that, that the church be growing, becoming stronger, becoming more influential, rather than a negative thing of thinking that the church should become smaller, more persecuted, the world's going to become more wicked. My view's always been on that, is that the reason why our society has become more and more wicked is because Christians have become less and less involved, and in a sense and Christian, that's why there's a desperate need for Christian philosophy, because we need to be more involved. We need to be thinking more. We need to be more intellectually robust to be able to argue and defend our case and to be apologists. That's what when Peter says, he says, be prepared to make an apologia, be prepared to, argue and rationally defend yourself in your faith. So I hope this is, I think I will be, I've got quite a lot out here there. I think I really need to consider Romans 13 in detail, but I think I've tried to give you like a general feel for stuff, and I very much hope, visit my blog, have a look at the master's thesis, because that was excellent. I mean, my supervisor actually, I got a special commendation for that one. I think, I got a degree. What was my master's? It said something with pass with distinction. That's it. So it was that good, and it was that good. It was an excellent piece of work. In a sense, it was almost like a doctoral standard. I think that the master's thesis there, and that's why I hope for it to be published in its own right. But you can read that as a thesis on my blog. So I'll try and put a link to it, because it really goes through how that degeneration and that of our eschatology caused people to withdraw and become very negative towards the culture which they were living in. And that's why, in a sense, the Reconstructionist movement and what loosely became known as the Dominion theology movement, with all the controversy that surrounded it, but it was really an argument about, let's get re-involved and re-engage with culture. Okay, so I think I made myself a bit. Okay, so I'm gonna. So I hope that's sort of whetted your appetite there. Obviously, there's not too much of the, and this is very much Christian philosophy, but I do hope the little bits that come in, I think they've got broader philosophical application, as well as to what we're interested in as Christian philosophers. I think there's some stuff and some issues there, particularly about how we consider the role of the state, our relation to it, which we'll look at in more detail, which are more general philosophical. Okay, so thank you very much. I will see you next time.